Okay, so to anyone who missed the opening session, a very good afternoon to you all and a warm welcome to the first session of the Climate Friendly Climate Research Conference. My name is Adam Pavlov and I work at the Center for Global Change and Society at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences here in Vienna. And this year I've been coordinating the research project, which goes by the same name as the conference here, Climate Friendly Climate Research, and I have the pleasure of chairing today's first session. Now, maybe just by means of a brief introduction, for the most part this conference will be looking at innovative solutions with which we can reduce our carbon footprint and overcome the barriers to doing so. In this opening session, however, we'll be focusing on the carbon footprint of the research system to begin to get a feel of the size and scope of the issue and what the main drivers of research emissions are. In this context, it is my pleasure to introduce the presenter of today's session, a colleague of mine here at the University, Dominik Schmitz. Having studied environmental sciences at the University of Graz, Dominik spent over 7 years working in various positions as a consultant on the global carbon market. He has worked as a key expert in a large EU-funded capacity development project for policymakers in Mexico and Indonesia. And at Borkul, Dominik is head of advisory services for the university's carbon offset system. He has also been involved in greening the university on various levels and has led investigations in the framework of this project on the carbon footprint of the research system. Without further ado, Dominik, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam. Very nice afternoon, morning or night to the participants. So we have about 50 minutes to talk about the problem itself and the carbon emissions that the research system is creating. The idea is that here's the outline of the session. I will firstly talk about the problem definition of the footprint of research systems. So where are our main carbon emissions occurring at universities, at conferences, etc. Then the second big part of the presentation is how can we quantify the carbon emissions. So there I will talk about data requirements, about methodologies, how to quantify, also about gaps that can be found for carbon footprint calculation. Then there will be some polls, so you also have to do something. In between of the first and the second part, we will have a little question and answer session. So please, David, at this time, unmute the participants so that we can have a little discussion. Then we want to make use of the chatting possibility, which is not possible at face-to-face conferences. And there we have thought of 3 topics to include in the chat, and please feel free to participate and provide us with your experiences. Adam will bring the first chatting topic in a minute on the right line. And then before ending or before coming to the final open discussion, there will be a reporting back what had been chatted during my presentation. So Adam will give us a summary about topics that had been discussed so that we have a good inroad into our open discussion. Yes, one word to the place where we are working. So we are based in Vienna at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences. We are working at the Center for Global Change and Sustainability. And here we are realizing societal responsibility, and we are a team of 15 members where we try to implement innovative ideas such as these research projects, and we are trying to establish a learning environment to drive our university, but also other universities, towards a more sustainable place. We are a founding partner of the Alliance for Sustainable Universities in Austria. There are currently 9 universities taking part in this alliance. Of course, we're doing teaching and research coordination on topics of sustainable development. There's an ethic platform which a colleague of mine is leading, where ethics and science are being discussed, so problems of ethical questions, and also the EU Joint Programming Initiative, where Sebastian and his team are working, is situated here at the center. So, as you can see on the right-hand side of the chat, Adam has already placed the first question. So the question is, have you been involved in a carbon footprint calculation? And if yes, what are your experiences and recommendations for the team? So probably your institution or probably you as an expert have done carbon footprint calculation for a company, and what are stubble stones where we should be looked at. The presentation that I'm giving today is based on the research in this project that had been started in January. So how to evaluate and improve climate-friendly climate research. What I'm presenting today had been also written down in a policy paper. You can find it under the link here. Probably you want to read some of the issues that I'm discussing. You want to read in further details in the policy paper. Don't be scared, it's not too long. It's some 15 pages or so, and also some nice graphs, so not only text. But the work that we're trying to do here is, as Adam said, not only evaluate what are the emissions, but of course to go further and to see, well, where can we really reduce? So where do we find the main emitting sources of the system, of the research system, and what can we then do to reduce these major sources? And of course, this video conference, as we are having today, is one of the tries, the innovative ideas to implement. Before going into our research results, I would like to ask you, where are you coming from? And there again, my colleague Adam will support us to calculate our emissions that would have been occurred if this conference wouldn't be virtual, but if you would meet face-to-face in Vienna, and if flight emissions would occur. So we have a poll here, which you can see. Please just click where you're based from, which continent you're currently based. So whether you're in Africa, Asia, Australia, Europe, North America, and as you can see here in the on the slide, we have just typed in some reference destinations and have looked at the emissions of these reference destinations. So for Africa, we said, okay, let's just assume that participants would have come from Lagos to Vienna. Whether people are from Asia, we assume that they are coming from Singapore to Vienna. So this is just not a perfect calculation, of course, but for the sake of exercise and also for getting a first number, what are our emissions, I think this is fine. So please give your votes. The poll will close in about 1 minute because there's just one slide in between. And this slide shows where, in terms of events, the majority of the CO2 emissions are coming from. The source of the slide is the German company Atmosphere. Atmosphere is providing carbon offsetting projects for personal flights, so personal flight emissions, but also for meetings. And they have developed a quite fine carbon calculator for meetings, where you can type in the distance where people are coming from, the transportation mode where people are coming from, so whether they are came by airplane, by trains, by cars. Of course, the accommodation is one part which should be looked at. The catering, so whether this had been a regional menu with regional food or with organic food. The energy of the building, so whether it had been an old building, a big hall, etc. So They have done a good work on this. You can access the website under www.atmosphere.de. And based on the different events that had been made carbon neutral by their side, they detected that about 70% of the emissions are coming from travel and transportation, the majority, and just 15% is the accommodation, 10% the catering, and the other things are not so relevant. So of course travel is the majority that we have to look at. And I will now ask Adam whether he can already provide us with some results. So we have prepared an Excel sheet which is based, which you can see here. So we just type in the number of the participants, and then we multiply the emissions both ways in tons. So for one back and forth from Lagos to Vienna and Vienna Lagos, it is almost 2 tons CO2. So and then we can calculate the emissions and the total number of emissions.
So the first piece of very good news is that in fact we have 5 continents represented as opposed to 4 as I initially assumed, and on the basis of 18 participants who took place in the poll, we have, just by holding this conference virtually rather than all of us flying here, saved 28 tons of CO2 between 18 of us, which equals about 1.6 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per head.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Adam. Thank you very much. Yes, so as you can, it is just a rough, but I think with an accuracy of about 70 or 80% calculation, which only means the flights, and then as we saw before from the slide of atmosphere, 30% are coming from other sources. So we have to add some 30%, so that would mean we are about 37 tons of emission that we are reducing with this conference. Okay, but as I said, it's just the first shot at the issue, but you can easily imagine that we can refine this calculation much more and get more into details. Okay, let's start with our results of the policy paper. So first of all, we had to look at the problem itself. So what are carbon emissions of universities, of research organizations, a relevant factor? Yes, they are. I will show some studies later on, and they are mostly on the rise. So especially in Europe, other carbon sources like the industry are going down. The scientific world emissions are getting up due to the more international linkage of research. Well, while companies who are emitting CO2 in the European Union are regulated by the trading schemes, research organizations do only have to report voluntarily, so there's no obligation in most of the countries that research organizations have to reduce their emissions and also to report their emissions, which also leads to the fact that data availability is not perfect in this area. So if you don't have to report something, you do not take the big efforts. Yes, some universities take voluntary goals to reduce their emissions. And as we have read in the UK, reduction regulations for universities are being initiated in the last years. But for other countries, it's all a voluntary issue. Yes, one word to the European trading scheme. There about or more than 11,700 companies are regulated to quantify their emission and also to reduce their emissions. So when we look at the whole picture, we have to take into account different stakeholders, and those were investigated by us. So of course we have to look at the universities itself, at the institutes, one word to the institutes in advance. So there are not many data for institutes. If there are calculations on carbon emissions, you can only find them for universities. We have to look at the individual researcher compared to, well, not researching a citizen. We have to look at the research programming and funding, such as the Joint Program Initiative, which has been initiated this conference and also funded the project. Then we have to look at research project itself and of course on meetings. And what we did in spring this year, so our research was for 2.5 months. We looked at, we did a desktop research, we analyzed studies. In terms of emissions from universities, we mainly had to rely on sustainability reports or direct communication. And based on this, we developed an Excel matrix to quantify emissions of university and of research programming, while for research programming, we just got good data for the GPI, so for the Joint Programming Initiative, which I will show later. Okay, so looking at the scope, there's a study which has been done in the UK. They have found out, it was done by the company Camco, which is a carbon consultant. They looked at the tertiary sector, and UK universities are responsible for over 12% of the UK's public sector emissions. So it's about 2 million tons of CO2. But this is not had not been done completely. They couldn't look at the emissions generated by procurement. So, for example, if a company buys paper or new cars, this was not included in this calculation. They didn't include the international students, their travel emissions, and also the business travel. So a majority was not taken into account in this study. I would assume that 20% could be added to this almost 2 million tons of CO2. So as a first result, we see that emissions of universities are often comparable to those of companies. And as I said before, companies are regulated, or major companies are regulated in the EU. Universities and research programming is not. Getting a bit deeper into the numbers, if we look at some universities in detail, Paris, Diderot, they emitted almost 30,000 tons in 2011, and just as a comparison, this is about 20%. This is about the emissions of 25% of Austrian ETS installations. So in case this university would have been covered by the European trading scheme, they would need to quantify their emissions according to the regulations of the trading scheme and also reduce their emissions. One study from the US shows that they have looked roughly. This study does not go so much into details, but they looked at emissions from different higher education institutions, and they average a bit more than 50,000 tons of CO2, which is really a lot. One record that we found was the University of Toronto in Canada. This university emits 160,000 tons per year. Yes, so this was one first glance at universities which we mostly found in studies. I will later go on more into details of our own calculation, and there you also then will get a picture how you can calculate the emissions of universities. So which method must be used. But now have just a short look into emissions of individual climate researchers. There's a study from the NILO Institute, which is the Norwegian Institute of Air Research, so also an institute which deals with the atmosphere and climate change. This study shows that the scientists produce on average 3.9 to 5.5 tons only as a result of their business travel. So they have the usual emissions of a European citizen, of a global citizen, which in 2008 were 4.5 tons, but then their travel emissions due to their work will be added. So it's almost a double the amount of a global average citizen. And also here, more than 90% comes due to air travel, only 5% from hotel usage. In comparison to that, the non-scientific stuff emits less. Of course, they are not traveling so much, and the working related emissions are just 1.9 until 2.4 tons of CO2. Emissions of conferences. So we just calculated how much we are not emitting here. Just 3 examples. The Planet Under Pressure conference, probably some of you had been there in March last year. It was attended by 3,000 participants, and their emissions of more than 2,000 tons were calculated. So this is just to get an idea of those of you who are not so much in the numbers tons CO2 and cannot imagine so much of these. The average citizen in India is emitting 1.2 tons per year. So this is yes, this is double the amount of an average Indian, or a quarter of an average German. And as Adam said before, the 15th Conference of Parties in Copenhagen, it emitted more than 70,000 tons. I think now Warsaw will not be emitting so much. Copenhagen was really a record conference, but still emissions of COP conferences is really remarkable. Some results of research programming. So also, I will show you later the methods, how we did this calculation. So joint or research programming is funding project, is coordinating research. And so not only universities are emitting, but of course research programming as well. It was very difficult to get data here. We approached different research funds in Vienna. Also on the side of the European Commission or European Union, we didn't get any data about research programming emissions. So that's why we looked into details of the Joint Program Initiative program, and their emissions in 2011 were 200 tons. Looking also into the real world, what does it mean, 2,000 tons CO2? It means an energy-related emission of 550 megawatt hours, which is quite a lot. You can power a small village in Germany of 550 people with this, or an Indian town of even 5,500 inhabitants. Or if you think to kind of offset these emissions by a solar PV. I mean, solar PV is quite a costly measure to offset emissions, but you would need to install a 0.6 football field of solar PV per year to offset emissions, and that would cost you roughly €1 million. Currently, prices are getting down, but it's a quite costly issue to reduce the emissions. Okay. So now looking into the methods, the data, and the gaps that we find when we look at university research programming projects, when we look at the carbon the carbon footprint of this, how did we do this, the calculation? Well, firstly, we researched about a standard which can be used to quantify the emissions. Most suitable standard and widely used is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard. It was developed by the World Resources Institute, also by the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. It's okay to use. It's designed to quantify carbon footprint of companies, so it's not perfect. And also maybe in the discussion later on, we can find some solutions how we can improve this standard. Just a short word on the standard. So emissions are generally grouped into 3 scopes: scope 1, 2, and 3. As you can see here on the cloud, the 6 gases of the Kyoto Protocol are taken into account. So CO2, HF6, CH4, N2O, HFC, and PFCs. When it comes to universities, mostly 2 of these gases are only relevant, which is the CO2 and the methane. So the CH4. Other gases are related to industrial processes, which will most likely not occur in universities. So this is the standard. When it comes to scope 1, these are the so-called direct emissions. So, for example, if a university has an own power plant to produce electricity or to produce heat, this is often not the case. So, scope 1 is rather small at universities. Some US universities have their own power plants. So mainly emissions in the so-called scope 1, so in the direct emissions, are the emissions from your cars, so the vehicle fleet. Scope 2 are mostly the major emissions of universities and are easier to quantify. These are the so-called indirect emissions, so emissions that are occurring when you use power for your university, when you use heat, when you use these streams mainly. So to quantify this, you need to have the amount of electricity, the annual amount of electricity that your university has used, the annual amount of heat or air condition that your university has used. Then you can calculate the scope 2 emissions. Then the most difficult part are the so-called scope 3 emissions. And here everything what is travel, so employee commuting, is been included, water use, so purchased water and also wastewater, product use, so paper, cars, etc., building amortization, and the gray energy. So these are the parts of the scope 3, and there's the problem that many universities do not look at the scope 3, but it is often the major emissions of a university. So we'll come to this later. When in terms of the scope 3 emissions, they are only mandatory to quantify if they are relevant. So also in a refrigerator of a university, some HFC gases, so cooling gases, are occurring, and if they are being emitted into the atmosphere, you will have global warming. But these are just minor emissions, and you do not have to take them into account. So here, emissions that are more than 1% of the total emissions have to be quantified, and others you don't have to look at. So that was our matrix that we developed for 9 universities. The input data were mostly provided by research teasers and by sustainability reports. Yes, we have only one time series of our own university. Others were, well, provided in 1 year, the sustainability reports. In the other years, they didn't update the numbers. So this is one of the gaps that should be filled when it comes to carbon profiles of universities. The data and also this chart you find in the policy paper where I gave you the link at the beginning. Here are some of the results. So as you can see, emissions are very heterogeneous. The first three columns is our own university, so we're emitting about 5,000, a bit more than 5,000 tons. And then you see other universities. And what you see is also the difference in the scopes. So as I said before, scope 1 are only minor emissions, so these mainly emissions from your vehicle fleet. Scope 3 and scope 2 are major emissions. Some universities don't look at scope 3, such as University of Plymouth, which is number 4 in the row. So they don't have a green column. At some universities, especially in France, University de Versailles and Paris, you see that scope 3 is the majority of the emissions. So this is mainly because they are looking at the amortization of buildings and of traveling. So here we need a big kind of better coordination between the universities and standardization. Of course, it is different when it's a technical university or a non-technical university because of the power consumption. But unfortunately, we hadn't the possibility to look at more than 9 universities, so these difference between technical and non-technical couldn't be found out during our research. One important thing is the time series. So how do emissions of a university change over time? Here we have our own university. You see there's a big jump. The jump doesn't, so between 2009 and 2010. However, this doesn't relate to actual emission increase. This relates to the fact that one new building was inaugurated, and also that the data collection system was broadened, so getting bigger and including more buildings. So also always you have to look at how much is covered when it comes to the calculation. But 2010 and 2011 can be compared, and there you can also see that the scope 3 emissions, so the green part of the column, is getting bigger. So especially flight emissions have been increased from 2010 to 2011 at our university. And like this, when you have a nice time series, you can see how your university emissions are being developed, and also how your reduction measures are being successful or not. So in terms of results, yes, carbon emissions of universities are mostly on the rise. This is a result from our desktop study. In Europe, they are mostly quantifying according to the greenhouse gas protocol standard, so there is no other standard. Some universities just calculate their emissions without standard, then you cannot compare them with others, so we didn't include them. And scope 3 is the big problem when it comes to accuracy. So sometimes it's 0% like University of Plymouth, and sometimes it's 70%. Of course, the location of the university could play a significant role, whether it's in the high north, so there you might have bigger emissions from heating, from electricity, also from travel when it's in a remote area. But again, here our number of universities which we analyzed wasn't enough to look at, so there would be bigger research needed. Yes, always when it comes to data which are not perfect and standards which are partly taken into account and not, we have to see, well, how good is it and where are the main gaps. We had a discussion how we can analyze the gaps, and at best it is to look at the IPCC good practice guidance, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They provide the so-called TACCC principles. So two nice acronyms in this heading. TACCC stands for Transparency, Accuracy, completeness, comparability, and the last one is consistency. And this means transparency. So transparency is not perfect when it comes to emission profiles of universities. There's not a clear and sufficient documentation. We could not understand how the inventory was compiled, which were the input data. We didn't see any Excel spreadsheet of universities which were taken into account for the calculation. So that must be improved. The accuracy we couldn't determine because there was not enough transparency. Accuracy means that calculations should neither over nor underestimate the emissions. At best, or if you have to do some judgments, you always have to be on the conservative side, so you better overestimate your emissions. It's important, but again, here we didn't get the data to look at. Completeness. As I said before, scope 3 is a big issue which is often not complete. So many universities didn't look at their travel emissions, didn't look at the building amortization, etc. So also here we need improvements. Consistency, which means the annual trends. I showed you the example of our own universities where in the 2009 data couldn't be used because they didn't include the whole university. And consistency means, and when you make a time series, that you always have to take the same data. So this is an important part, which currently at our research is not so important because we didn't have the time series. So we only from our own university, we have actually 2 years which we compare. And of course, comparability. So one has to be compared, one emission profile of a university has to be compared with another one. So that is an important good practice guidance. Yes, so these were the calculations that we did in terms of emission profile of universities. I would now like to open briefly the floor for some ad hoc questions that you might have or some input. If you have some deeper questions or if you want to wait, you can also put them into the chat. I see that we have a lot of things that Adam can report later on. And during this feedback and Q&A session, I would also like to do 2 other polls. In total, these are 4 questions. So the first question is, do you know emissions of your institution? Yes or no? We will open the poll in a minute. And the other one is number 3, do you know your personal annual emissions? So have you done a carbon footprinting yourself already? Just a second, I will open the poll.
Okay, so maybe we can, while you're doing that, Dominic, just open the floor to questions. I would ask you all, if you look at the sort of the top of your screen, you have the possibility to raise your hand. If there's any questions, please just click on that button and we'll take them one by one.
Okay.
So whilst we're waiting for questions, Dominic, I have one myself. You mentioned at the beginning that universities' emissions are indeed comparable to the emissions of companies within the European Union emissions trading system. Indeed, some universities, such as the University of Toronto, are considerably higher. Possibly a sort of, I don't know, do you think that universities, obviously as public institutions, should be regulated by a system such as the emissions trading?
Well, I think it would be a good idea, and it would be possible because you can, with, well, some more efforts that had been currently put into the issue, you can quantify very exactly the emissions, and as we see, they are for Europe a really important emitting factor, and universities are there to also find ideas how to reduce it. So in my view, that would be a good issue.
Thank you. Are there any more questions?
If not, I will just go through the end of my presentation, and then we can have a discussion at the end. I would like to include 2 more poll questions. Let's see if I can. No, I can't find them. One more and another one to wake everybody up for the final questions. Okay. Do we have the poll? Because the next poll question would be: does your institution has plans to reduce emissions? Must be. Okay, is this one. And the last one: do you offset emissions personally? Let's do this one. No. Okay, so we skip the last one, just the 3. Please enter your votes. Okay. Yes, now we come to the method to analyze emissions of a research program. There were not these nice methodological guidelines than we have in the greenhouse gas protocol standard, but we could find the method of and use the method of the atmosphere company. So, as I said before, Atmosphere has developed a method to quantify emissions of meetings, and the main work and the main emission that were occurring in research in the research program of the GPI program were from meetings. So we had a look there. We calculated it for 1 full year, for the year 2011. So we got data from the office where they had listed all the names of the meetings, and then we included it into the atmosphere, so to get emission from travel. It's a good accuracy level, I would say, so of 90 to 95%. Some assumption had been made, but not many. So these were emissions from the meetings, and then of course we had to look at the office staff. So we took the full-time equivalent of the office staff, and these were multiplied by an average carbon emission factor of a university worker. And the results were that 86% of the emissions in 2011 came from travel, and 30% from meals. So this is just the meetings itself. And when we look at the just a second, okay, the full-time equivalent workers, it was 5% of the whole emissions, compared to the 95% of the meetings. You can also read through it in the paper that I told. So the majority of research programming in terms of joint program initiative comes from the meetings. When it comes to carbon footprinting of projects, carbon footprint of initiatives, David, the presentation is gone. Can we get it back? Okay. Okay. Carbon emission of conferences of individual researchers. I have to say that in terms of carbon emission of projects and institutes, we didn't find any suitable data. If you have some data in mind, we can discuss it later, and we're looking forward for this. But usually projects didn't calculate their emissions on project-by-project basis, so it's only the the university which were calculating it. Same with the institute, so we didn't find any institute which did a carbon footprinting just for the institute itself. So we couldn't publish it, and also I mean it would be a nice comparison when we look at the project costs and at the emissions or when it comes to the institute. So how big is the institute? How much emissions do they have? So we could make some comparisons here, but of course you cannot compare one project directly to the other because they differ a lot. So carbon emissions of conferences, I already told at the beginning, and of individual researchers. They are published in different articles and websites, the results we discussed already above. So just two points that I want to pick out, as said above. So they are considerably higher than national and global averages. The per capita emissions of researchers, and one record meeting was for sure the COP in Copenhagen, which more than 70,000 tons of CO2. So conclusio, more research is needed, which is often the conclusio for a research project, but it's not for getting more money on this, but because there are really big gaps. So it would be interesting to develop a suitable standard for quantifying carbon emissions of universities. So the greenhouse gas protocol is a good step and methodological guidance, but based on this, it would make sense to develop really one for universities. Like this, we get a good basis to detect where emissions occur in the research system, to come to our final goal, which is not quantifying emissions. I mean, it makes fun to quantify emissions, but the plan is, of course, that we have to look where can we really mitigate emissions and implement the measures. And when we have a good quantification and a good monitoring system, we can, of course, see which of our mitigation measures succeeded and which didn't, and how can we improve the whole planning of reducing emissions. Yes, so from my side, that was the presentation. We have now about 10 minutes to discuss what had been chatted. I would like to ask Adam to give us a short result of the chat, and then we want to open the floor to everybody to discuss. And thank you very much from my side for your attendance.
Thank you very much, Dominic, for that first overview of the issue we're dealing with. Maybe just once again, I posted it earlier here in the chat. You can download the policy paper, which goes in that covers the subject in more detail. In terms of if I would just try and summarize what we've been talking about here in the chat, and again, many thanks to several of you who have been very, very active in the chat there. It's great to have this means of communicating sort of alongside the presentations as well. I would say the main focus was on this interesting question of, well, we're avoiding considerable emissions by participating in this conference virtually, but obviously we need to be aware that the internet itself has considerable carbon footprint. Inga, many thanks for some of your posts. Posted an article from The Guardian which estimates the carbon emissions of the internet at about 300 million tons of CO2 per year, which obviously is quite significant. Yeah, I mean, I think one can have many discussions about that issue. I'd say that sort of if we compare the emissions of our activities here, participating in this conference virtually, to actually doing so in person somewhere in Europe or wherever else, then it's really just a fraction we're talking about. But I think we need to be aware of the consequences of all our actions, and that would probably be sort of the summary. On the other hand, there was a few mentions from our from colleagues from Africa asking, and I'd pose that as a question to you as well, Dominic, whether there was whether you found or whether you looked for any emissions from universities outside of the Northern Hemisphere, and if so, what kind of results you found.
Mm-hmm. Yes, also from my side, thank you very much for posting the questions and being active in the chat. Yes, I also think we have to look at the emissions of the virtual world, and I'm curious to read the article in the Guardian. Still, the emissions from servers, etc., from electricity that we now all need for our laptops are much less than for running a plane. In terms of emissions of universities outside Europe, we hadn't had the chance to look at these, so it was, sorry to say this, also kind of well, not a mandate, but we were asked by our founder to look mainly at the Northern Hemisphere, so it was a project by the Joint Program Initiative, which is responsible mainly for Europe. And so we had, this was our main focus. But if you have emission profiles of universities in Africa, I would very much like to have a look in the documents or on the other hand, if you need support when you do an emission profile yourself for your university, I'm also happy to support you.
Yes, and you can find Dominic's contact details here, and obviously just once again considerably more detail also on the various standards and so on are available in the policy paper. And I think just for the last few minutes or so of session one, we'll now open to any comments, feedback or questions. So I'm just going to pick out the question here from the chat by Tobias. Thank you. He says, Dominic, has the certification of Boku by the EMAS system and to all other participants, our university has been certified by EMAS, the European Environmental Management System, since 2006. Has that certification had an influence on the emissions performance of Boku, Dominic?
No, it didn't. So the influence is that we get the data more easily. So it is collected centrally of one of the manager of the certification. So we get data of fuel use of the cars, electricity use, heating, etc. And then, well, finally, EMAS also should implement measures so that you can really reduce your electricity and your energy use from year to year. But as far as I know, there wasn't, and we also see it in the emission profile from 2010 and 2011 that there were no considerable reductions in energy-related emissions and energy use. But normally, EMAS, if implemented well, and that is probably not yet the case at our university, if implemented well, it is a strong tool to reduce energy-related emissions.
Thank you. Obviously, the requirement for data is very necessary before measures to reduce carbon footprint can be taken. And I must apologise to Caesar, who posted a question up there a little earlier, which I missed scrolling through the chat. And Caesar asks sort of the comment that the innovation to produce low carbon infrastructure is obviously, on the one hand, going too slowly, on the other hand, very expensive. And sort of based on the research we've done, is there any specific advice one could give to decision makers in developing countries?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I think the whole conference is about the question which measures can be implemented. And there I would also ask Bernhard Zagel from University Salzburg or other colleagues which had been in this project, whether you find some good reduction measures. So in my view, it is important to look at the win-win situations, of course, to reduce emissions in these fields where you can also save money. Mainly this is in terms of energy consumption. So if you have a policy, for example, in your university saying, look, you shouldn't put the air conditioner so that it's not being colder than 21 degrees or so. Here, the university could also save money and emissions, of course. And these measures are important to discuss. And I think especially tomorrow and on Wednesday, these sessions will discuss these mitigation measures in further details. I think it's the session also where Günter Getzinger is Professor Getzinger is presenting, isn't it, Adam?
Yeah, that's the session 3 at 4 p.m. Central European time tomorrow. So please do tune into to that. There's one more question here from, I think we'll take that as the last question, and we'll wrap up session 2. And before we go into that, maybe just the comment. Thanks for all the comments and questions in chat. Feel free to also verbalize any of your questions. You can, at the top of your screen, there's a sort of a little man with a raised hand. You feel free just to click on that and raise your hand. If there's any issues in terms of microphone or whatever, please just let us know in the chat right away. So yeah, the last question, I think this is yeah, a crucial question from Inga, and again I'm going to pose it but also make reference to 2 sessions which we have tomorrow afternoon, one at 5, one at 6, but particularly the session at 5 p.m. tomorrow afternoon, looking at ways of overcoming personal and cultural barriers to mitigating the carbon footprint of research, which we'll be looking at precisely those issues. But Inga asks, have we looked at all into cultural change at universities, particularly with regard to Helga's quote, the vanity parade, i.e. how do you overcome the fact that no one really wants to be the first one? It's this sort of first mover problem which we always have of actually refraining from attending a conference. Dominic, maybe as a last bit of input.
Yeah, I think that is the major issue which we have to look at and which we have to overcome. I'm not a psychologist, but in terms of also the ethics of a university, which I said before, that our institute is also involved in the ethic codex. Yeah, there a discussion about cooperation and confrontation or raised, and so I think here we also have to find new ways of just working together also at the university without being just proud of flying around the world and so I don't know in which session this will be discussed further, but I think also at the last day there will be kind of a wrap up and trying to find solutions and recommendations out of the conference. So maybe until then we have some further a good collection of cultural changes that we need to make and how we can make them.
for that, Dominic. I've just put in again, so sessions 4 and 5 on Tuesday are going to address these issues in more detail. So, Dominic, thank you very much for that input. Very much appreciate the sort of very detailed look at the issue. And I would suggest we'll just take a couple minutes while Seth gets set up. We're very much looking forward to a session now coming from the other side of the Atlantic, as viewed from Europe, from New York, looking at virtual collaboration in the framework of the work of the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute. So, Seth, if you want to get set up, and let's just take 2 minutes and come back at 5:32 by my watch and get started with session 2. Thank you very much.